Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mysterious Galaxy. I am very excited. It is Friday, so happy almost weekend. At this point, I think everyone's probably off work, so happy weekend to everyone. And I am so excited because we have two YA authors here tonight. These lovely ladies you see with me, and you guys are very familiar with their books. We have Amanda Foody, who is in conversation, or we have a new book by As the Shadow Rises by Katy Rose Pool, which is the sequel to There Will Come a Darkness. And that was one of our picks for our book subscription. Yay! So you guys are familiar with that one as well as Amanda because our book club has also read her. I am so excited because we have a night of YA fantasy awesomeness, and I am biased, but it's hard to get too much better than that. So I am going to go ahead and let our authors take it away. 2 notes for you guys. There is a letter white down below where you see buy book. You can buy the author's books, as the name would imply. For Katy, we do have personalized book requests. You have 1 week until now to order those. And for Amanda, we have signed book plates, which is super exciting. So make sure you click that button. And also, if you would like to ask a question, there is the Ask a Question button down below. And if you hit that, as the name also implies, it will pop up a little box and you can ask whatever questions you have for our amazing authors. Okay, go ahead and take it away, guys. Have a good event.
Thank you. Awesome. Foody, I was just noticing how, like, even when we're just looking at our screens, you look taller than me. I'm like, how is that?
There we go. I'll just stop. AirPod down.
Well, how are you? How was release week?
I don't know. How was your release week?
It's been good. Yeah, I mean, you were on deadline recently. I'm still on deadline. So it's always a little hectic, like balancing that with like fun events and like posting on social media. But overall, it's been good. It's definitely interesting, like releasing a sequel versus like a first book in a series. And now you've done that twice, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I do not. Were you able to actually get work done on release day? I'm curious because I
no.
Have it.
I scheduled that whole day off for myself. I was like, I'll work through the weekend. I will take release day off because I also had to like run some errands. Like went down to a bookstore to sign books and stuff like that. So I did not plan to work on release day because I knew I wouldn't get anything done.
Smarter than me. Should we also shout out the cocktails that we made for this?
Yes. Right before we get started, let's do a quick cheers.
I didn't actually ask you. These cocktails are supposed to be based on each of our books. I made a Gambler's Ruin, which is one of the cocktails from the North Side in the city of Sin. It's Levi's favorite drink. And I made the recipe for the first time a little while ago, and it's actually pretty good. Didn't think Levi had good taste, but here we are. So yeah, I didn't ask you, what are you drinking, Katy?
So, you should tell us what the recipe is. I am drinking a Keeper of the Word, which cocktails that aren't really a thing in my fantasy world the way that they are in Ace of Shades. But my brother-in-law is really into cocktails, so he made all of these cocktails based on my book last year. And so this is a Keeper of the Word, so it's like Jude's drink. And it's based on the classic, like, Prohibition era cocktail, The Last Word. But instead of gin, it has scotch in it. So it's my favorite.
Oh my God, I love that so much. All right. Well, cheers.
Cheers. And I guess we should probably, I mean, some of these people probably are familiar with one or both of our books, but let's just do like a quick
pitch.
Okay. Yeah. Or if you want, you could do mine and I could do yours. That could end disastrously.
Well, you know what? I think we should do each other's individual. Like we should do each of our own books because we have to put the sequels and everything in there.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Since you suggested this, would you like to go first?
Nicely done. Really quickly, you can still see me. I just saw. I think it's my mom in the chat said my video is gone. Can you see me?
I can see you perfectly fine.
Okay, great. Okay, so There Will Come a Darkness, the Age of Darkness series, which is displayed behind my head, along with Foody's most recent book. There Will Come a Darkness is a YA fantasy that takes place in a world in which there were these 7 prophets who had these prophecies that helped guide the world and shape history. And the book takes place 100 years after these prophets have disappeared, and no one knows where they've gone. But they did leave behind one final prophecy that predicts the age of darkness. And so the book is about these 5 very different characters who are all involved in this prophecy in one way or another, although they don't necessarily know it to start with. And they're basically trying to figure out whether they are going to be the ones to stop the age of darkness or whether they're going to be the ones to start it. And then book 2, which just came out on Tuesday, follows those same characters. Without saying spoilers, by the end of book 1, they have a pretty good idea of what their roles are in this prophecy. So it's really them trying to figure out like whether these destinies are really preordained for them or if there's things that they can do to change those destinies. And there's a lot of other issues they're dealing with too, like sibling drama and, you know, relationships and evil cults taking over their kingdoms and treasure quests and all that fun stuff.
I feel like I have to shout out. I read Katy's first book, There Will Come a Darkness, back in, I think, early 2018. And I have loved it ever since. I think I'm proud of the fact, I hope at least that I was the first one, but I made a fan playlist like way back when. And it is still on my Spotify.
It's still on my Spotify.
It is a public playlist on my Spotify account, and you can absolutely listen to it. I made it back in 2018.
Yeah, I still listen to it, Foody.
Yeah, really?
I do.
On there that just like was the best like Jude and Hector song. Like as soon as I found it, I was like, this is it.
Oh, I feel like I know which song you're talking about. Yeah. I do think you were the first person to make a playlist because I actually don't have, I mean, we can get into this later. I don't have like a book playlist for this book that's not just like video game soundtracks.
I should absolutely think about this. I am like all about my book playlist.
I'm aware.
So shout out my series. So I wrote the Shadow Games series, which is a trilogy. I've got all 3 books here. First, we've got Ace of Shades, we've got King of Fools, and then we've got Queen of Volts, which is the one that just came out on Tuesday. It's the finale. And the series takes place in a city called the City of Sin. It's inspired by like a magical Atlantic city. And it follows 2 characters in particular. The first is N, who is this prissy girl from finishing school who has journeyed to the City of Sin in order to track down her missing mother. And then we have Levi Glazier, who ends up partnering up with her, but he is very far from the gentleman that she is expecting. He is a con man and a very famous card dealer at one of the city's top casinos. And the 2 of them go on a big adventure through the city, through cabarets and murderous card games, and find themselves caught up in all sorts of political and historical drama. And so Queen of Bolts, the last book in the series, is pretty much still following their story. However, with every book of the trilogy, we've added lots of new characters to the cast. The world gets bigger, the world gets darker. There's even more murder games. And so yes, in the finale of the series, we kind of pull it all together with by far the biggest cast that the trilogy has seen yet. So that's that. And yeah. How'd that sound? How did I do?
You did great, honestly. I have already read your series, and I want to read it again now. So well done. Well, actually, I should say I have not read the 3rd book in this series because it did just come out. But let's kind of start there because I am currently working on the 3rd book in my series, and basically, I would like to pick your brain about your experience of kind of completing a whole series, especially one that is kind of as large in scope as Ace of Shades is. And I think our books have that in common. Just how did that feel to kind of like reach the conclusion and to tie everything up, and just give me all of your advice as I'm like struggling with this.
I think it's very funny that you're asking me this because I have a vivid recollection of maybe like April or May, probably April of 2019, where I'm calling you because my plot is broken and I don't know what to do. And we were on the phone and we like solved the major plot crisis. So I'm very impressed that I somehow still managed to give off the impression that I ever had any idea.
What's funny is like, I don't think I actually gave you anything that useful beyond like, oh, that kind of sounds like the game Assassin. And like, you were like, what's that? And I explained it. You were like, okay. And then several spreadsheets later.
For backstory, in Queen of Volts, there is a card game that is basically a game of Assassin, you know, like that sleepover game where there's 22 players and every player has a target. And if you don't get your target's card, you die. And it was very, very complicated. I had a massive spreadsheet, it was on a Google Sheet. I shared it with Katie, and then I freaked out to her for like an hour straight. But overall, finishing the series, it feels pretty good. I think over the course of the process, when I first drafted the book, it was by far the hardest and most chaotic book I have ever drafted. I typically am I won't say that I am like the most detailed of plotters, because I don't have those kind of mega thousands of words long outlines that I know a lot of authors use. I have these very minimalist outlines, but I do really rely on them. And in this particular book, it just, from the beginning, it was just not revealing itself to me. I was kind of writing a few chapters at a time and then stopping, figuring out what was going on, and then reading a few more. And so it was just a really difficult process. And so when I first finished the draft, I did not feel like I had achieved anything. I thought that I had written this horrible broken series, that I had set myself up with this really complex game at the end of King of Fools, and then totally set myself up to fail. And I think it took several iterations of the book before I finally felt like I had truly found where the story needed to go and what felt like the actual right ending for the series. So it was one of those experiences that I still feel like the idea that I finished the trilogy has barely sunk in. Because it took so long to get to that point. I think give me a few more months and I'll feel the full weight of it. But yeah. So in like regards to sequels, obviously this is like finishing a series, which is different than the middle book, but I would still argue that as difficult as it was to write Queen, there is nothing like the awkward middle child. So tell us about your awkward middle child. What was it like to write that? How was it different than writing the first book?
Well, what's interesting is I feel like there is this prevailing narrative that the second book is like the biggest challenge of a series. And I can definitely see why that's the case. And I've certainly experienced as a reader, like reading a series where that second book is just, like you said, like kind of the awkward middle child. But I didn't really feel that way about As the Shadow Rises, which I think, I mean, it's obviously really nice that I like had a good time writing this book.
You're like, oh, look at you.
And I feel a little bit like I'm like bragging about this, that like my second book was not just like awful and like soul crushing to write. Like it literally, just even saying that it didn't crush my soul feels like I'm bragging because of how much
Bars really live for us.
writers complain about book two. But I think for me, it was because writing There Will Come a Darkness crushed my soul. So my soul was already crushed by the time I had to tackle As the Shadow Rises. So at that point, there was nowhere to go but up. And essentially, my experience of writing this book was like, I had put so much time and energy and just like emotional well-being into There Will Come a Darkness that when it came time to write book two, like there was both a really, really intense fear, because I'd never written a sequel before. Like there was no indication that I like knew how to write a fantasy trilogy. Like I had never done that before. So there was that really intense fear, but it was kind of balanced against like, I felt like book two, I was getting to part of the story of the series and part of the story of these characters that I was just really excited to write, like stuff that I had already planned out from writing There Will Come a Darkness about like where these characters' journeys would take them. And so that sort of excitement kind of carried me through the process of writing it. And I won't say that it was like 100% an amazing experience, because I did not enjoy drafting this book. And Foody, you were actually there when I like finished the first draft of this book.
Oh my God. Was I there? That memory sticks out. But we have this massive critique group. Picture like 12 women shoved in this tiny little Airbnb, all like very determined to kind of like party our way into BookCon.
No one else was on deadline. I had a deadline that was like the next day, like right before BookCon, and no one else was on deadline. I was the only person doing anything. Trying to finish this book.
And every single person came into this writing retreat fully aware that they would get absolutely no writing time, except for Katy, who was like in the corner, like head down, like I don't even want to look at the wine you're drinking, like let me finish my novel. We're all very, very impressed.
I'm like honestly still shocked that I managed to turn that draft in, and like I don't know. It was definitely an experience. But I think when I started to really start to enjoy the process of writing, it was like during revision, because I always like revision. I don't usually like drafting.
Same, absolutely.
And like, especially for this, like as a second book, like there was a lot of stuff that I just wanted to write about. Like there's like my big example is always like I wrote like a party scene in this book because there's no party scenes in There Will Come a Darkness. So I was like, well, it feels like I need to write a party scene. So I'm just going to engineer this whole plot line such that I can write characters attending a party, which is like,
oh my God.
You know.
I'm thinking if I've ever written a book where the characters don't attend the party. Oh man. Maybe, I guess there isn't one in my middle grade book. It's a feature. It's a staple.
Party scenes are just always fun. Like there's never... Like, I'm never mad about there being a party scene in a book. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
All right. Let's see. I'm going to check the next questions that we have here.
I mean, I know what I want to talk about next.
Oh, okay. All right.
Which is, you kind of mentioned this in your pitch or in your summary for Queen, but what I really love about your Ace of Shades series is that you sort of build it into an ensemble cast by the end of the series. So there are a lot of characters in Ace of Shades, but you really only get the two perspectives, Anne and Levi. And then in book 2, you add another perspective. And then by book 3, you have what, 6? Is it 6?
There are 5 in book 3.
Okay. So you're right there, same level with There Will Come Darkness, which just has 5 POVs throughout the entire series.
I think once I wrote Queen of Bolts and I actually had 5 narrators for the first time, it also really dawned on me what Katy had managed to do in her other books. Once I realized what kind of editing.
Oh, this is hard.
Yes, actually, I think I interrupted your question.
It didn't end up being a question. I was just talking about ensemble cast. But let's just talk about sort of our approaches to writing ensemble cast. I don't know if we've ever actually like really discussed this, you and I. So I'm interested. Yeah. How did you decide who to add? Like, what were your goals in doing this doing this finale as an ensemble?
Yeah, no. So for the Shadow Game series, even though it does become a true ensemble cast over the course of the series, the way that I structured it, I wanted it to always feel like Levi and Anne were at the very center of the story. And every new character, even though they might have just as many chapters as Anne and Levi and just as much importance to the plot, I wanted it to always feel like they were in the periphery of Anne and Levi, because the way that the world is set up and the way that the magic system is set up, without going into spoilers of any of the books, Anne and Levi are very much kind of at the heart of all of the conflict in the world because of the types of magic that they have. And so I wanted the initial book to feel like this really intimate story about the two of them finding one another and like the story beginning. And then as their kind of legend rises, because in the City of Sin, like everything is about legends. So as their legend goes on to be told, I wanted everyone else to feel like they were in their periphery or their orbit, like they could be the collateral damage. That was always kind of what I was going for. Let's keep expanding it and see who else has been affected by their story, while Anne and Levi have been so focused on their own problems. Like, how is everyone else dealing with what's going on? Queen of Bolts also shifted the perspective a little bit because we introduced the character of Harvey, who has always been an antagonist at this point. And so the perspective that he brings on, it kind of calls into the question, like, are Anne and Levi, have they ever actually been the center of the story? So that was kind of where I was leading to, like the initial like 2-character, like kind of intimate story, and then bringing in Jack, who was kind of the character who always felt like he was in his best friend's orbit, and then moving into this kind of shifting perspectives. But in terms of choosing the characters about like who would be those additional narrators, it was usually just, it was never necessarily like, oh, like I need to tell the story of this character. Because at the end of the day, I feel like if I was using that as my approach, I could have
done any.
I would have done them all. Like I love them all. I would want to get deeper into all of their heads. So like nothing would have stopped me. So I had to narrow myself more by like which characters would really offer something to the plot or the world, like through their eyes as they go off and do their thing. What part of the city can we explore that we haven't explored before? So I had to come at it from a very logistical point of view, curtail to just make it more and more complicated.
Yeah.
So your series, now correct me if I'm wrong, do you keep kind of the same core narrators throughout every single book?
Well, I do feel like if I answer this, that's like a spoiler that they all live through. But I'm never, with a small caveat in book 3 that I will not elaborate on because it's a spoiler, I will say I'm never adding POVs.
Okay.
So that's my way of saying it without telling you whether all the characters are going to survive through book 2, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I'm never adding a POV. We really focused on this same group, which is like very much in contrast to basically what you're trying to do with, well, what you have done with Ace and with Queen, which is building it into that story. I think There Will Come Darkness is a series that it's always been focused on these 5 characters, and the difference really is not necessarily knowing how they're all going to play a part in this like Age of Darkness, in this prophecy, and in each other's lives at the beginning of the series. And then by the end of the series, you basically will have all that information. Like how do all their stories come together? Like, why is it that we are following these 5 characters? We kind of know, like, okay, they're all involved in this prophecy, but we don't necessarily know how. We don't necessarily know, like, whether they're actually going to fulfill those roles or not. And so my perspective was not necessarily, like, I think it's quite different from what you've done, because all 5 characters are extremely central to the plot. And I think it does kind of shift from book to book who gets the most focus. So as an example, Beru in There Will Come a Darkness doesn't really have that many POV chapters. She definitely has the fewest, but she comes into much greater focus in book 2, which was really exciting for me to write. And I would say, like, Hassan is like a huge plot driver in book 1, and he definitely has a huge role to play in book 2, but he's not necessarily as much the central focus as he was in the first book. So all of the characters are sort of shifting in and out of, you know, getting to see more of their story, getting to see more of their growth. And then, yeah, so it's not necessarily like everyone gets the same number of POVs and equal amounts of page time in each book. It is kind of shifting, but if you take the series as a whole, like, I think each of the characters has like a very central role to the story, and then also, you know, their own character arcs and their own character growths from where they start and then to where they end. So I feel like it's just a very different approach. What?
It kind of leads me into like a question that I really wanted to ask you.
Okay.
So it's a question that I actually get a lot. That's kind of just like, you know, how much did you know in book 1 about the whole series?
Right.
But I feel like yours in particular, you have a prophecy, and the whole series is based upon the fact that the future is coming, and then we are getting this clue of what the future holds. So how much did you actually know, since you kind of pre-wrote it?
This is a good question. And I think the process of discovering what the whole series was about was kind of my process for writing book 1. Like, I think I I couldn't, and this is perhaps why book one took me so long, is because I could not finish the first book until I knew where we were going in book two and where we were going to end up in book three. So really, yeah, by the time I was completely done with revising that book, I did have a fairly solid idea of where the main plot was going, you know, what this Age of Darkness is, how it's going to come about, how each of the characters are involved in bringing it about or stopping it. And I think that I just could not finish that book until I had all of that figured out. So it took me like 6 years. And by the time, I mean, essentially, you've gone through this process, I'm sure. When you sell a series, you kind of have to like give your publisher like a sense of what the next, like what the two books that you haven't written yet are about.
I actually did not have to do that because
you're right. You sold
kind of a less traditional way of my publisher buying the series, where the first book in the series was actually acquired with a standalone before it in a 2-book deal, and then the last 2 were bought in a second 2-book deal. My publisher, I mean, there was always the expectation it would be a trilogy, but they definitely kind of trusted me with the story without having a single clue of where it was going.
What's so funny was like they'll ask you for like what, or at least for me, they asked me for like what the next 2 books would be, and so I only had to send them basically like a very short 1-paragraph thing. It was very just like, but I had done so much work on it behind the scenes that I was like, oh, like to my agent, I was like, oh, do you want this like 4-page long like description? And she was like, no, we want like 1 paragraph. Oh, but what's really funny is that 1 paragraph, if you read the description copy of As the Shadow Rises, it's actually like very similar to what we initially sent them. Like that 1 paragraph that we sent them, where I was like, this is what happens in the book that I haven't written yet.
I did have this experience for my middle grade series. The first 2 books were all together, so I had to give them that exact same like 1-paragraph snippet about book 2. And I am so impressed that you stuck with it. Now that I've written that second book, I know again like what that must have entailed, and I am like once again very impressed that you managed to do that. I feel like I departed so completely.
Well, that's why writing book 1 was so intensive for me, because I was potentially writing the whole series without actually having to write it. It was like, but like, what about you? Did you know for Queen, like what was going to happen? Like at what point did you know how this was going to end?
So you know how sometimes like a lot of authors will talk about their series having a turning point, or like a moment where everything is at this point on, it's very different. For me, that turning point is at the end of Ace of Shades. I really feel like the cast in particular, from going from Ace of Shades to King of Fools, the cast doubles in size, the world triples in scope, everything becomes so much more complicated, a lot more mature, a lot darker, and they really felt there's a great difference in between the 2 books. And so I had a fair amount plotted out, and there was so much. I had a lot of King of Fools plotted out, I should say. I knew certain things about Queen of Oaths, but not a lot. But I really did know King of Fools. And I knew it enough because I had to decide how much of that complexity I wanted to bring into this first book.
Yeah.
There were a lot of characters in particular that I consider like absolutely vital characters to the series who you don't even meet in the first book. They're hinted at, and you might not even realize they're being hinted at. Ace of Shades, I think, because I made those decisions that I chose to withhold so much of what is actually the grand story in the first book, I think it's both, it might put in readers for a little bit of a shock going into book 2, just because it is suddenly so much bigger. But at the same time, I think it does make Ace of Shades a really fun book to reread, having read Queen of Oaths and the whole
Yes.
Everything is hinted at, so I didn't want to take up that much page space. I didn't want to go on for pages and pages and pages when I didn't feel like I needed to yet. And so in rereading it, there'll be like all these clues that's like, oh, that's this character that we haven't met yet, or like, oh my gosh, I can't believe how early this was seeded. I would say 50% of the time when I seeded a clue, it was because I had something planned out. And the other 50% of the time, it was because in the third book or in King of Fools, there was something that I figured out then that I drew upon something in the first book. So it makes it was in early.
That's always my favorite thing is when, as you're writing this series, or just even one book, when you go back and you're like, oh, I mentioned this little thing. Maybe I can use that to like solve this problem later on. But I have to say, like,
everything ahead of time.
I have to say, like, that, what you're describing, those, like, dropping those little hints and clues, like, that's both my favorite thing about writing a series, and I think my central anxiety about writing series, which is, like, my ability to pull that off. And I think that was, like, as I was really finishing edits on There Will Come a Darkness, like, that occupied my brain 100% of the time, as I was like, am I setting things up? Like, am I seeding in these clues that I'm going to need later in books 2 and then in book 3, which I hadn't even, like, I was like, who even knows? And like, now that I've at least like written a draft of book 3, like, I feel like I understand that process so much better than when I was looking ahead and thinking about, am I gonna be able to do this? And I feel like it is one of those things where you don't necessarily know until you have finished the series.
I felt like for me, King of Fools, it was complicated to write because I had to introduce so much, because then there's all this new stuff that I needed to bring in addition to recapping the first book and all of that.
Yeah.
The Volts was probably the most complicated book just in what it was individually. But the plot was really complex. It had the most narrators, and of course it had to wrap everything up. But I didn't personally find the wrapping things up to be quite as stressful as I was worried about it being going into it, because I have historically hated writing endings, and I was thinking,
really,
oh no, this will be an ending. I like writing like the exciting climax chapters in the final act of the story, but the true resolution chapters where it all just
interesting. I always feel like those denouement chapters come kind of easily to me, and it's usually the climactic sequence that I'm rewriting 500 times. And the denouement chapters stay like the last chapter of There Will Come a Darkness stayed pretty much the same throughout the whole process of writing that book. Same with As the Shadow Rises, the very final chapter. I think I changed like maybe a paragraph.
I will actually revise my statement. I still don't enjoy the resolution chapters, but the teaser epilogue is something that I have found over and over again. I absolutely adore it more than anything.
I feel like you and I both kind of have this where it's like, it's almost like the post-credits scene in like the Avengers movie.
Yeah.
Where you're like, and like ended the story, and then it's like, look over here. What's happening? No hearing is there.
I experienced it for the first time because when I sent my editor Ace of Shades, she actually asked me, she was like, I think you need something at the end, like a teaser. And then as soon as I started writing it, I was like, my blood is pumping, like my heart is racing. I'm so into this. Like, I have to do this over and over again. And yeah, I think that's going to be something that I do in probably almost every single series I write, because now that I've tried it once, I'm like kind of addicted to that.
It's fun.
Really, really fun.
It's super fun. Yeah. Well, I feel like we could continue talking amongst ourselves for like hours, but maybe we should take some audience questions.
No, that's a good plan. See.
Like, I have a million more questions that I have for you that we didn't get to, but
that we didn't get to yet. If we run out, we can return to them, and then I can berate you about the romantic relationships in your series.
Okay, but like, I would also be berating you. So we really want to start that. Okay, I'm going to try to manage this.
All right, I have the top question here.
Okay, you, it's all you.
Yeah. What do you think your characters would do if they ended up in each other's worlds?
Oh, I think we have either talked about this or I've thought about it independently. Because I feel like ever since I read Ace of Shades, I was like, Anton would actually really enjoy the City of Sin because he's a gambler. And he's you know, adaptable, and he's able to like get by and play card games. So I feel like he and Levi could be friends. Like, I don't know that Levi would, I mean, I think Levi would like him, but he would just be like, that's that guy who plays cards at the card.
Levi would probably see him as like a rival card dealer or something.
And then I think Aphira would also do well because there's a lot of like corruption and evil in the City of Sin. So she'd have her pick of people to murder as the Pale Hand.
That's very, very true. Oh my gosh. I feel like she would do well. Oh, she would do well in the Doves. I can see that.
Yeah, she would just join the Doves and then,
right?
I mean, I don't think she would actually successfully take over the Doves. Maybe she would try, but she's not personable.
And like the white handprint and like the white hair, like I'm seeing like similarities.
Oh, totally.
No, that's great. Let's see. How would my characters do? I do think I always think of this, but like the difference in like technological eras is very grand. Yes. I feel like my characters would be a little like, where are the phones? Where are the subway? Where are the cars? Which means it means mainly that like they can no longer rely on firearms, which is the main weapon in the whole series. So they would be like relegated entirely to swords, and I'm gonna be honest, like they're not all that coordinated. So I feel like they went from being like these, like they could be like a real threat in the Shadow Game series to being like barely knowing how the whole story. But I think Levi would get by in a similar way that Anton did. I would think, let's see. I don't know how Anne would do. I think she would be really stressed. It's a really different place. Also, I think the relationship in your world with the religion and the idea of the prophets is very different in the Shadow Game series, where religion at this point is something that is kind of, it's a bit of a relic of an era that has a lot of bad blood for a lot of people nowadays. It's something that they look back on in an era that like they didn't really, that was not the best of times. So I think they would take a lot of adjusting, I think, to get into your world. I think your characters would probably fare better in my world than my characters.
Maybe so. Although I do think that Jude would just immediately die. Or like he would not be happy, at least. He would hate everything about the city.
he would absolutely loathe the city. But I feel like he's pretty capable. Like he's a capable fighter. I think that's a little okay, like don't knock my boy Jude.
So sorry.
That one character in my friend's books who like I cherish above all others, and Jude is the child that must be protected in Katy's books.
Ironically enough. Okay. First draft tips. Are your first drafts super tight and polished or chaotic and sparse? Chaotic, sparse in places, really long-winded in other places. Just like, it's just, my first drafts really, I think there's like a range too. Like my first draft for As the Shadow Rises was very short, actually. I had to build out several storylines. And then my first draft for The Outcome of Darkness was extremely bloated. Like I think I cut like 30,000 words from it.
Oh my gosh.
Wow. So yeah, it really depends.
The like overwriting way. That is not my first drafts. They're always sparse. I think that's the right word for them. They err more on the side of a screenplay. Like a lot of dialogue, a lot of action, and like choreography, I guess, like the characters moving around. A lot of internal narrative on the parts of the point of view characters.
Yes, yeah.
Usually something I add in later. Then so they're usually word count wise significantly shorter than the final product. I think Queen of Volts came in right around 100,000 words, and the finished draft is
it's like 150.
Is about 150, I think. Yeah. Which is a huge difference. Oh my gosh, that's really big. Usually the difference isn't quite like growing like another half of a book on top of what it is. Usually it's like another like, I don't know, 20% or something like that. But yeah, I normally end up adding, I usually find out like, I have to add in this other scene that I didn't think about, a character beat that needs to be added in, more description. The description always ends up bloating it. I have a lot of fun with description.
Yes, you do. And I have to say, like, let's not get too far off track because we do have more questions, but I remember writing Their Welcome in Darkness, or like revising it, and really struggling with the world building. And I remember reading Ace of Shades, and I was like, oh, this is someone who really knows how to like create a setting that feels extremely immersive. Like I was like definitely looking at your book, and I talked to you too when I was doing those revisions. I was like, Foody, tell me how to work, tell me how to do this, because your descriptions are so evocative. They're not extremely long-winded necessarily. I think that you do such a good job of like using a few choice details and like word choices to really evoke what the setting is, and like also setting the tone for the scene. Anyway, this is just me fangirling over you.
I love world building. I'm currently working on an adult novel that has 5.5 worlds to it, if that gives any indication of how much I enjoy world building. I think honestly my favorite thing, it's not even the description. I actually find such a joy in naming little details in the world. I
love naming stuff too. Yeah.
The newspaper in the Shadow Game series is called The Crimes and the Times. The subway stations, like their cocktails, like I love those kind of little details. It's something that I feel like I do in all of my books.
But they add such nice little like texture and stuff to the world.
It's basically me just like putting puns into my novels. I really have a lot of fun with them. I always think they're like cute or like, I don't know. They're
really unintentional puns.
Yeah.
We won't talk about that.
Getting started on puns, actually. Now I could talk about like the title that is a pun. I didn't even know it was a pun until book 3.
Okay, there's a lot of questions that are jumping in and out. Like the order of the questions is really shifting here. So,
wait, are you laughing at the same one I'm seeing?
I don't know.
I see one that says categorize Foody's characters. Oh no, it moved. Okay. Categorize Foody's characters as the assassin, the protector, the innocent, the prophet, and the prince.
Ooh. Let's try to do this together. Okay, the assassin.
I think I would say that Grace is the assassin. I feel like she and Afira, you do pronounce her name Afira, right?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
All right, I just listened to the audiobook, as you know, so it kind of like made me like reconsider how I pronounced everything from when I initially read the book. I would say that Grace would fit in as the assassin because that's what she did before she met Ed.
Right, yeah. That's that same connection there.
Then we've got
the protector. I want this to be Levi, but it isn't.
Okay, you know who actually I think has a fairly similar personality to Jude? I would say Roy.
Oh, yeah.
I think Roy has a very similar personality. He's kind of like the ex-white boot who was like booted out for being too good of a person.
I think N in the beginning of the series is the innocent, and by the end of the series, she is not.
Yes, I completely agree with that. Let's see what's next. We've got the
prophet and the prince.
And the prince, okay.
The prince is Levi, though.
The prince is definitely Levi. Absolutely. Like King of Fools is like Levi's book. That feels very right. And then the prophet. Oh, the prophet's Lola. 100%.
Oh yeah, obviously.
Oh my gosh, yes. You haven't read Queen yet, but I like truly the opening of Queen, without going to spoilers, but Lola has a point of view. Is basically Lola having that whole vibe. Like, it's very right.
Yeah. 100%. I'm in total agreement with everything we decided.
I thought that would be really hard, and that worked out. So the next question is, how do you keep a natural flow to stories while switching between different characters, chapters / perspectives?
For me, it takes a lot of kind of shifting things around. Like a lot of times when I'm drafting one of the Age of Darkness books that has 5 POVs, I do have some sense of like how certain scenes need to go in order, even though they're not necessarily in the same storyline. Like, I feel like in my brain, there's just like a natural kind of rhythm that happens between the characters' chapters. And I know that it's like very loud outside my window. I hope you guys can't hear that. Just like a car speeding by. But yeah, I feel like sometimes I just have this sort of like innate instinct for like when I want to switch perspectives, like how I want to leave things off with certain characters and like pick them back up. And like it gets really complicated because there's certain constraints, like how much time is passing between each character's perspective. For As the Shadow Rises, I pulled a Foody and I created a spreadsheet of the time passing in each perspective, like per chapter, like in between the chapters, like how much time passes overall. Like it was like a whole thing. And I had to like completely like rejigger some of the chapters in order for it to like make sense. But yeah, I feel like for me, it just takes some revision, like some sort of massaging like that. But I more or less kind of know like how each of these storylines kind of plays off each other as I'm going, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. For me, at least in Queen of Volts, and let's see, without like giving too many hints away, but I've been working on 2 projects right now that both happen to have 4 narrators. So I guess I've been playing with a lot of like multi-POV books for a hot minute. And in general, kind of across all of them, a lot of it really does come down to chronology. Sometimes like things just got to go in that order. Like,
yeah, sometimes you are really stuck. You're really like, I would love for this to happen first, but
right?
a day passes here and it's the next minute here. So there's really no.
Right? Like it's like it was storming in the last chapter and now it's sunny and they're supposed to be happening at the same time. And you're like, crap. Like all those types of finagling of things. Yeah, I normally kind of rely on chronology and just like, I think a lot about what are the major plot beats in the story and where do all like which characters have those plot beats. Kind of just making sure that they all feel spaced out enough. I do sometimes have very strong opinions about the order of specific chapters. For instance, at the beginning of Queen of Volts, it first opens with Harvey in a chapter that I've actually always kind of actually referred to as a prologue as opposed to a chapter because it has that kind of vibe to it. It's very quiet, kind of sinister. There's not a lot that actually happens in it. It's just like dark talking, sinister talking. And then I would say the true first chapter is Lola, who is the second chapter of the book. But because Lola's chapter also, it's a lot of talking in it, at one point I had an editor recommend that I switch it with the end chapter that follows, because end chapter has a lot more action to it. But no, I felt like I needed like the smoke. I needed everything to start rising.
I've had similar experiences, especially at the beginning of the book. I think the order in which those first characters' chapters go feels like very like concrete to me. And for As the Shadow Rises, I actually changed it around. So in the original draft, without doing any spoilers, there's like, in the original draft, there was like an Anton chapter, and then we got the Jude chapter like much later than that. And at some point during edits, we like switched them so that we got like that Jude chapter first. And that was like a really hard thing for me to do because in my brain, I was like, no, it needs to go like this. Like it just has to. And then when I was like, okay, but what if you did this? And then it would still like play off of that sort of.
I had this one section in Queen of Volts where one of the characters discovers something about the other character, and there's a bit in Game of Thrones where that happens, where like the one character discovers vital information.
Yes, yeah, I love that.
And then you see it and you're like, oh my god, and then it pans to the other character in like that sinister, quiet way, and like you as the viewer are like looking at them in a whole new light. Like that kind of stuff, the information reveal. It was kind of all this circle of like the plot beats and revealing everything. And
yes, yeah. that you're describing too, that sort of dramatic irony of like giving the reader more information than, actually, I don't know if this is what you're describing, but like more information than the character has. Yeah. That's my favorite thing about multiple well, one of my favorite things about multiple POVs is being able to give information in a certain character's perspective that affects another character, but they don't know it yet. And there's a moment like that in As the Shadow Rises that I'm very proud of. And me and my editor like talk a lot about that kind of stuff of like, okay, well, when we find out this, like this character doesn't know it yet, but the reader does, and it just creates that sense of like dread and like impending doom.
Oh my gosh, I'm really proud of it in book 2 because there's a whole thing in book 1 that I think you do such a great job of. It's not necessarily that the other character knows something. It's more that just a fantasy reader who is a big
yes,
expectation is there. And so I think as a reader, you more than likely might catch on to this one thing early, and then the whole book, like the dread of it happening.
My favorite thing as a reader is like guessing a twist before it's revealed. So I always try to like have some semblance of that where the reader can be in on something early and be like, oh no, the character needs to figure this out.
No, I love that too. I've had a few readers say, like, at the end of King of Fools, I've been sent, messages from readers that were like, ooh, this is my theory. And I was like, you're right. That is correct. I've had a few of them.
Oh, do you actually tell them that they're right?
No, not But for the most part, I think what I've gotten from people who've already read Queen is like, I didn't see any of this coming. Like, oh my God. So
I that's fun too. Like, you want both, really.
I mean, obviously, a lot of it I didn't want people to see coming, but a few people did manage to guess a few things here or there, which is probably the right amount of mysterious. Like, it could have been deduced, but most people might not have been able to see it. I love plot twists. They're the best. They make me feel so like an evil mastermind, basically. See, here's a comment with a vote. How clearly could you envision the overall arc of the series of final climax of book 3 at various points in time? Oh wow, this is
100% clarity. By the way, this is from someone named Shawnee, who is either my brother or someone who has the same nickname.
People are asking how much did I know when I first sold the book, the very first book, when I finished writing that book, and then when I finished the second book. Okay. I would say that when I first sold the book, I knew a little bit, but I didn't know a lot. And that's because when I first sold the book, I had not read the book in 2 years. A lot of time had gone by. It was a very unorthodox acquisitions process where my publisher was kind of like, didn't you write this book that we liked years ago? And I was like, yes, I did. And they were like, can we buy that too? And I was obviously thrilled, but at the same time, I was like, I've not read this book in a minute. So when it was first acquired, I actually went in and then fully rewrote it because it had been in 2 years and I was older and wiser and had grown as a writer and I wanted to completely redo it. So I did that. So when it was first bought to then when it was finished, they were really, really different books. And then, yes, going into book 2, I would like to say that I had it all figured out. And like a lot of the big twists I did. I'd say every single twist that you see within the first 15 chapters of Queen of Bolts, and there actually are a lot of them, most of those I did know ahead of time. It's usually the twists that are like way later in the book, apart from just a handful, that were deduced as I wrote the third book. It was a good mix, I would say.
Yeah, I would say for me, so having now written the end of the third book, at least a draft of it, in percentages, he says. Okay. When I first sold my first book, I can actually kind of break this down because there's kind of like a couple main components of the end of book 3. And one of them I knew when I sold the first book. So we'll say that was like 30% I knew when I sold the first book. And
okay,
I would say 30% when I finished the first book.
You were talking a pretty big game about like years had passed of plotting and figuring out like and it was just 30%.
It was 30% because there's like one big thing that happens at the end of book 3 that I knew. Actually, no, there were 2 big things that I knew. So 60%. Okay. And then it stayed 60% when I finished the first book. Because honestly, between selling the first book and finishing the first book, I didn't do like a ton of edits. And then when I finished my second book, actually still 60% because I didn't figure out this last component of the end of the series until I was writing the draft and finished the draft. So it was 60% the whole time. Hope that answers your question. Thank you for calling me out for spilling my drink. That's really nice of you.
Oh, man. What are the unique challenges when writing a finale?
Should we?
Yeah. I don't know. My finales are all different in each book. I'd say that King and Queen have similar finales because they take place over many chapters. You know, there's so many characters happening. They all have finales. It's like a good quarter of the book is just like boom, 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 boom. Whereas Ace of Shades has like I think a true chapter that is the climax chapter. So they're kind of different in that way, and I would say they each have their own challenges. The hardest part of the Shadow game in Ace of Shades, it was just making it interesting because I had to explain how the game worked, like all the rules of this really complicated game, and then play the whole game and then make it interesting, and that was really difficult. And then otherwise, I think it was just balancing the timing of all of these characters' chapters and all of this excitement kind of like dominoes falling is how it felt.
Yeah, I'm not sure actually if this question is referring to a finale book or a finale of one book.
That's true. I guess I interpreted the finale of a book.
Yeah, my challenges when writing the finale of one book is usually, at least with this series, usually the finale involves kind of all of these, I'm trying not to be too spoilery, but kind of all of the storylines like coming to a head together. And so figuring out sort of just how all of these characters who have like their own separate storylines, like how they're going to fit together by the end is kind of like a puzzle for me to solve. And it usually involves me rewriting the end of like the third act of the book like several times. So
I feel like the third acts always end up kind of staying as they were, I think is usually.
I really envy you that. Mine will not do that. It's always like I change one thing and then I have to like completely reorganize everything.
There's a very, very major event that happens at the end of King of Fools that did not happen in the first draft.
Oh, yes, I know what you're talking about because I feel like I'm one of the people who talked you into it.
That did not happen the first time I wrote the book. And so the ending of the book had a different emotional note than it did when I wrote it. Not giving spoilers.
Not giving spoilers. Okay, I think, should we take one more question because we're almost on the hour? Sorry, everyone. Talk too much. What were your writerly goals for your most recent releases? Well, this is a good question. I like this one. What did you hope to accomplish as a writer?
Ooh, okay.
I love this question, actually. You're going to let me go first? Is that what you said? Okay. So for As the Shadow Rises, I mean, ultimately what I wanted to do was write a sequel that people who had read the first book, I mean, why would you read a sequel if you haven't read the first book? But anyway, I wanted to write a sequel that people would read and say, wow, this sequel really exceeds the first book. I am extremely proud of There Will Come a Darkness. I love it. I think I did the best possible job of writing that book that I could. It was an extremely ambitious book. I recently reread it actually to do like an annotated copy, and I fully still love the work that I did on that book. But I wanted to write a sequel that people would read and be like, this is better. So that was my goal.
Ooh, I'd say mine was twofold. One, I had been hoarding plot twists the entire series. So I was very ready to kind of release all of those like explosions at once. I was very excited. I wanted to pull all of those off. I wanted to write the kind of finale that would subvert the entire series up until that point. I wanted it to be the kind of series that after you finish it, kind of like almost like the Sixth Sense, like you have to go back and then reread it because like it's all different now to some extent. And then the other thing is, I think on a character note, I think the more, despite all the books in the series having these really complicated plots, I really do feel like I write very character-focused stories. And I feel like I grew more into this with every single book. I think Queen of All is probably the most character introspective of any of the books, especially because King of Fools ends on a fairly traumatic note for everyone in the cast. And so when we enter Queen of Olds, everyone is kind of shell-shocked. Everyone is trying to figure out how they're going to respond to, you know, their safety net being pulled out from under them completely. And I think just like dealing with that interiority of all of the characters in a way that I didn't want to write a series that was like full of action and like, you know, crime and all that kind of stuff, and then have characters brush that aside.
Yeah.
I really not want to do that. I wanted it to feel like they they really had to process what was happening to them and decide who they were going to be from there. So juggling those two things, I think, are my goals for yeah.
Well, it is my unfortunate job to have to pop back up and say that we are at the hour, but I do have one more question before we leave for you guys. I know that we are celebrating new releases now, but it was one of the questions people had asked, and I know they're always curious. So I figured a last question could be, what are you currently working on? What can readers look forward to next? I know we've gotten a couple little crumbs mentioned throughout this, but
and there's maybe some stuff that can't be talked about, but for me, mine's pretty straightforward. I'm writing book 3 of this series right now. I'm working on revising that and making that the best possible finale to the series that it can be. So I'll definitely be bugging Foody some more for advice on how to do that.
So I have a middle grade book. It's my middle grade debut coming out. It's called Wilder Lore. It's kind of like a Pokemon meets Aragon sort of story.
Nice.
And that comes out in March, and I'm very, very excited about it. Please follow its Instagram account. It has like its own little cute Instagram account. I'm really proud of it. And then I do have another book coming out in 2021 that I cannot talk about yet, but I will be able to talk about very soon. And that's all I will say.
So stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for mysterious reveals. Amazing finales too. I think you touched on a very good point in wanting the second book to be even better, because that, like, when you find a series that does that, it just like, it just does to you in such the right way.
Yeah.
But I am going to go ahead and sign us off for the evening. I want to say thank you so much to Katy and Amanda. Thank you so much to all of our awesome readers. This has been such a pleasure just getting to hear you guys talk. Thank you for letting us into your world, everything.
Thank you so much for having us.
Cocktail book. Maybe you guys could like mash up and do a cocktail book. I'm just going to throw it out there. I'm just going to plant the seeds. But if you guys would like to purchase these books and the book plates, the link is going to be right down below. And thank you everyone so much for attending, but have a good night, guys. Bye.
Bye. Thanks so much.